Welcome, everybody. Iran's nuclear program, winners and losers. There are some positive expectations, moderate positive expectation, about the agreement among the six powers and Iran on the subject of a nuclear power for Iran. There have been improvements, but there are still many concerns, especially in the region, in the Middle East, Israel, for instance, or even other countries of the area. Winners and losers. Is that really about winners and losers? We will try to understand and get a political conclusion during this session by looking through this deal or this potential deal and the technicalities with our distinguished guest. So let me introduce you the guest, Mr. Sayed Mohammad Kazem Sajapur, advisor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Please. Thank you very much. Trita Parsi, President of the National Iranian American Council from the United States. Thank you very much. Mr. Newt Gingrich, former Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. Rajab Safarov, General Director of the Center for Modern Iranian Research from Russia. And Rajiv Sikri, former Secretary of the Ministry of External Affairs of India. So, let me start. So, I would like to start first and give the floor to Mr. Gingrich, who must leave us earlier because he must get a plane to Rome, if I'm not wrong. We heard before in the session, the previous session, that there were a lot of concerns, especially from Mr. Ehud Barak, about this deal and about Iran and the nuclear. What is your point of view? And from America, do you think that the State Department and the administration, not only this administration, but the previous ones as well, have dealt with this issue in an appropriate way?
Well, I think that the Obama administration was able to put together much stronger and more effective sanctions than many of us thought they would be, and I think the effect on the Iranian economy was pretty real. My view is that if the deal is continued, if it is transparent and accountable, and if you have a pretty high level of belief that you can avoid nuclear weapons being built under the deal, that probably it'll work. There's a lot of ifs in that. I think it's pretty clear in the American Congress on both sides, Democrats and Republicans, that if it doesn't work, that there would be enormous pressure to increase sanctions and be even more rigorous in the next phase of this, because I do think the American position in both parties is to not find an Iranian nuclear weapon acceptable. And so I think the pressure would be very great. But for the moment, I think you have to give the President and Secretary Kerry some real credit. They seem to have built a sanctions regime that worked enough, combined with the election of a new president in Iran, that there's at least some reason to believe this may work, and it's certainly worth giving it some time to see if it's real. I will say, from an American perspective, the frequency with which Iranian officials basically undercut the deal rhetorically doesn't help. I mean, to have somebody say, you know, well, we're never going to agree not to build a nuclear weapon, which at least two officials have said since the deal was cut, increases our suspicions and makes us more inclined to put pressure on. But for the moment, I would say that it's a wait and see and hope that it actually works kind of position.
But basically, I think that there is also a misunderstanding at global level. Has Iranian the right to go nuclear apart from the military aspect of a nuclear issue, or not, according to you?
Oh, I think that if you have an inspected and a transparent nuclear weapons side, I think the world is probably relatively willing to concede that the Iranians have the right to have a peaceful atomic energy program. I don't think that's the issue. I think the issue is that there is a point here where it ceases to be peaceful, and crossing that point would be, I think, totally unacceptable to the United States.
Mr. Sajapur, what do you think about it? Would that be enough, a civil program? Oh, okay. Ah, yes. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. The question is, do you really think that for Iran is enough a civil nuclear energy program, and put aside and forget about the military aspect of a nuclear?
I think your question is loaded. We never had a military program, so I think it's very clear, and I think one very interesting aspect of this whole negotiation is the changing assumption on the issue of Iran nuclear program. The assumption which the others were trying to build upon was that this program is of not a peaceful nature. And based on this assumption, they really unjustly imposed a lot of sanctions on Iran, and also created an image in the media and so on and so forth. But what has happened in this process is that Iran has come and said, you are suggesting that we are of not a peaceful nuclear program, the nature of program, so we go for the maximum transparency within the international legal frameworks. And this is what we have done so. And on the other hand, you should lift all sanctions. But what's important, sir, is the changing assumption that it is not nuclear at all. So your question, I'm sorry to put it in this way, is irrelevant, because Iran didn't have a nuclear program of military nature, is not going to have, and will not going to have.
Yes, but let other countries to have this concern. When I asked question, you said that is irrelevant, but so you consider irrelevant also all the concerns of other countries. Maybe my question could be irrelevant, but I don't think that the countries, other countries of the region concerns are not irrelevant.
So, sorry to be very frank.
You said, too.
Is it enough for Iran, the peaceful, and should it go forget about the other side? I said, to start with, we have never been for a military nuclear program. But the concerns of the others, look, I can be concerned about anything in the world. I'm suspicious of you. You are going to kill me. You are going to do this because...
Really not.
No, I know. Because somebody has said so in a statement, and so. For any concern, there is a gauge and measurement. And for nuclear issue, there is a measurement that is called NPT arrangements. When you go to non-proliferation regime, it has inspection system, IEA, International Nuclear Atomic Agency, has the format. So if there is anything, you should go through that ladder and process, and there are enough, let's say, mechanisms and measures to address the concerns. But let's be frank. Let's be frank. The concerns that the others are talking about are not concerns. It's a pretext. It's a pretext to militarize the region, to radicalize the Iranian foreign, let's say, interaction with the others. And look, they are now blaming 5+1. That why have you made such a deal? Because the existence of that pretext was very good for them. I finish just for one sentence. Yep. So what has happened, I think, during this negotiation, Iran has depleted them from a very pretext that they were using. And that was a strong pretext, and they are shocked that how can it happen? Because they have been accustomed to a type of cognitive, narrative, pronouncement that Iranian program is of that nature. So I think it's a plus for international community, and there should be no concern. If there is any concern, there is a special, clear, defined measure to follow up.
So, Mr. Gingrich, do you think that the concerns are unjustified?
Well, I always find it a little confusing to listen to Iranian explanations. I mean, there's no question, I think as a matter of fact, that when he was president, Ahmadinejad said that Israel could be eliminated from the face of the earth. Now, that's a relatively strong statement. There's no question he said the United States can be driven out of the Middle East. So if you start from those kind of statements, there was a statement by Khamenei after the agreement was made that there was no question that Iran would give up the option of potentially having a weapon. So these quotes are all out there. But my proposition is very simple. If you don't intend to have a weapon program and you are prepared to have international inspections and you're prepared to have appropriate diligence, then probably there's not going to be a problem. So I don't understand what the problem is if there's no problem. But for a long time we were told as you buried various facilities underground and as you did a variety of things to make it very difficult to stop the program, it certainly looked like a military program. And most people, I think, thought it was a military, not just the United States, but all the other major powers that got involved in sanctions all thought it looked like a military program. So we can meet your test very easily. If it is open and clear and there are inspections and there's no question that it is not a military program, I suspect you'll see some kind of dramatic improvement in relationships.
Mr. Tritaparsi, please.
Thank you. First, I want to thank Speaker Gingrich for giving President Obama some credit here. I think that's very valuable in an era in which partisanship, unfortunately, has been too strong in the United States. I think, however, crediting this to sanctions or to point out, as the Speaker did, that where is the problem if there can be transparency, I think the key to this actually is part of the reason why we actually have a solution in the making is because both sides have compromised. It's not because there is massive pressure in one or the other direction. The problem that has been solved, that existed before, was that the United States insisted that there would be no enrichment on Iranian soil. And that caused also the Iranians then to be very inflexible in what they were willing to agree to. What the president has done now, through diplomacy, not through sanctions, is to meet the Iranians halfway. There is an acceptance that there is going to be enrichment on Iranian soil, and the Iranians in turn have accepted far greater transparency measures. This compromise could have been achieved years ago. It could have been achieved 10 years ago, had there not been for the insistence that there cannot be any enrichment on Iranian soil. Thanks to the fact that the Obama administration has adjusted from that very unrealistic position, a compromise has now become feasible. And that's why we're seeing progress right now, and that's why even folks that tended to be very skeptical are starting to say that they actually see a solution in the making. It's because both sides compromised.
Yes, I would like a comment from Mr. Sikri as well on this issue, the Indian experience, basically.
Well, I think that the Iran-US standoff was not only about nuclear. It was part of a larger geopolitical perspective. And what Mr. Parsi has said is absolutely right, that had the Americans wanted it, it could have been solved at any time. Why was the dossier taken from the IAEA to the Security Council? Because I think that the United States wanted a leverage on Iran while they were engaged in a war in Iraq. Why is the United States changing its mind now? Because the region is in trouble, and the United States presumably feels that it is in their interest to make up with Iran, because the Arab world is in some turmoil. The old allies are not necessarily the most reliable ones, and therefore it is time to cut a deal. I know we hear a lot of the Western perspective on this, but if I were to put myself in an Iranian's shoes, I would be very worried, because like this is something that, you don't go by intentions, you look at capabilities. And if you look at capabilities, Iran, and indeed the whole region, is surrounded by US military bases, US allies, with a history of intervention in Iraq, in Afghanistan, the 1953 coup. I mean, if I were an Iranian, I would say, I need to be a little careful on this score. Secondly, say, does Iran need a nuclear weapon? Probably not. I have interacted with Iranians many times. I've been to Iran many times. We have a long history of dealing with Iranians. And if there's one thing I'll tell you, they're very smart people. They're not stupid. They're not suicidal. So if you think that the Iranians are raring to press the nuclear button, that would be suicidal. I don't think they're that. But what is there is, like in any country, and I include my own country in that, is a great sense of self-respect, of dignity, that you can't push us around. We have a right under the NPT for enrichment. And I think, I may be wrong, but I think that what Iran is seeking is a recognition of that right. Not necessarily that they would go ahead and produce dozens of weapons, but the recognition of that right. Because please understand that those in Iran who are trying to cut a deal also are facing pressure. And if it was the same in India, I would feel the same way. Who the hell are the Americans who tell us not to do X, Y, or Z? So I think that if we start on the assumption that there is a goodwill, there is a good intention, then I think a deal is possible. And I'm very happy that today there is now a possibility of a deal, which I hope will be fructified. One final point. We don't approve of unilateral sanctions. I think that is not the way the new world order should be run. Because what does it mean? It means, I've got the bigger stick, I'll do what I want. Where do the world institutions go? Where does the United Nations go? Because if you do this, then somebody else does that, some reactive. So I think that unilateral sanctions and blackmail and so forth, we have suffered hugely because of the US sanctions on Iran. Our oil companies can't do business, and that's hurting us. So as an Indian, I feel that such sanctions are not in order. Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Safarov, I have a question for you as well. I would like to know your point of view about the principle that was exposed by Mr. Sikri on the principle, the simple idea that Iran should have the right, in principle, again, to have a nuclear weapon, considering the geopolitical situation in the area and considering the risks of the area, and also the dignity, as Mr. Sikri said. Do you think that these arguments are strong enough to justify a country to go nuclear?
Я считаю, что ваш вопрос абсолютно риторический и не имеет никакого, скажем так, актуального значения, поскольку он не лежит в сфере практической деятельности руководства Исламской Республики. Я не знаю, может быть, я ошибаюсь, но скорее всего, у немецкого философа Иммануэла Канта есть такая фраза: если математические аксиомы касались бы интересов людей, то и они опровергались бы. Знаете, мне кажется, что американцы очень и очень увлеклись санкционной своей политикой. Не хочу использовать слово «зомбированность», но иногда они так действуют, как будто есть железная стена, и они не слышат и не видят не только друг друга, но и интересы других государств. Они так увлеклись этой санкционной дубинкой, что порою их политика противоречит их собственным интересам и становится источником дестабилизации во многих государствах. Ярким примером того, что господин Гингрич сейчас не слышит господина Саджадпура, и они разговаривают совершенно на разных языках. Так вот, санкционная политика Соединенных Штатов мобилизовала все ресурсы Соединенных Штатов, Европейский Союз, международные политические институты, мировые финансовые институты, и все брошено на решение этого вопроса. Хотя руководство Соединенных Штатов заявляет, что они это делают в интересах иранского народа, и они назвали своей политикой внедрения калечащих санкций, но совершенно очевидно, что эти калечащие санкции калечат жизни простых иранцев. Топ-менеджеры Ирана, руководство Ирана, те, которые занимают определенные посты, как они жили хорошо, так они будут жить хорошо. А вот отсутствие коммуникации, изоляция Ирана, ущемление контактов, вывод Ирана из торгово-экономического пространства, это заставляет Иран сосредоточиться, замкнуть на себе, так сказать, использовать свои ресурсы, защищаться. И эти санкции превратились в возможности для Ирана. Во многих сферах эта страна стала самодостаточной именно и благодаря санкционной политике Европы во главе с Соединенными Штатами. Так вот, пришел новый кабинет, Хасан Рухани во главе этого кабинета. Философия взаимодействия с Европой и миром вроде бы меняется. И есть признаки того, что руководство Соединенных Штатов тоже как-то по-другому относится к этому процессу. И 24 ноября в Женеве было подписано предварительное соглашение. И все об этом знают. Но сейчас это соглашение под серьезной угрозой. Потому что именно американцы каждый раз, вопреки всем правилам и достигнутым договоренностям, вводят новые и новые требования, которые никакого отношения практически к духу и букве предварительных соглашений не имеют. Что означает последнее предложение Соединенных Штатов включить ракетную программу Исламской Республики в текст или в зависимости от достижения соглашения? Что означает предложение Европейского Союза, которое запрещает Ирану заключать договора или соглашения по строительству объектов мирного атома исключительно с европейскими государствами? Что означает последний мониторинг Европейского Союза о том, что Иран является страной, где права человека нарушаются больше всего, хотя мы знаем, в каких странах, которые являются основными партнерами Европы и Соединенных Штатов, о правах человека вообще, может быть, даже и речи нет. Но они к этим странам относятся совершенно лояльно. Так вот, на самом деле иранская ядерная программа – это далеко не локальная проблема современности. На этой проблеме сконцентрировалась борьба за выживанием, я бы сказал, за выживание Соединенных Штатов. И это сейчас происходит потому, что вот какой-то некий вариант конструктивного подхода к решению этого вопроса зависит от того, что американцы увидели, что без участия Ирана не решается годами ближневосточная проблема, не может быть найти решение по сирийской проблематике, неизвестно, что будет в Ираке, и, конечно же, в полной неопределенности является ситуация с Афганистаном. Казалось бы,
Thank you very much.
казалось бы, очень, казалось бы, очень и по логике вещей Америка и Запад должны взаимодействовать с Ираном, но глубоко политизированная проблема, которая оказывает давление на международную безопасность и тем более на региональную безопасность, мешает миллионам людей чувствовать себя комфортно. И виной этому является далеко не Иран.
Mr. Gingrich, you can reply. Mr. Safrov talked about the US, mentioned a series of mistakes that were made by the US. So please, I would like to have your comment on it, and also
Sure.
from
Look,
the other
I noticed there were
member of the
several
audience.
complaints about sanctions. Now, I'm not a big fan of sanctions. I think in a lot of places they don't work very well. And I think they tend to hurt the poor much more than they hurt the elites, because the government finds ways to protect the elites. Having said that, if you live in a world where you have a country you're trying to influence, and you have diplomatic talks, and that country isn't forthcoming, and you want to have some impact on that country, if you're trying to avoid going to war, sanctions may be the last, it's the least bad thing followed by war. And so people who say, this conversation's been going on a long time, which it has been, and we have been saying to the Iranians pretty clearly for a long time, we don't like the way you're doing your program. We don't like the degree to which you put things underground, where they certainly look like they're a military program. And the United States had two alternatives. I mean, the truly hawkish alternative was to go to war and to say, we're just going to take out all your facilities. Now, the moderate position was sanctions. So it's a little hard to say to us, gee, this was really aggressive because you took sanctions when you're trying to communicate with a country that didn't want to negotiate. And I think that's a fact. We now are at a point where this may all work out, but I don't think we should kid ourselves. If this breaks down, and if the Iranians decide that they can't be transparent and they can't be accountable, we'll be back in, I suspect, an even stricter sanctions regime. And what's the alternative other than war? I mean, I don't know theoretically what the third road is. If you've talked and talked and talked, you now have two paths. You can go to sanctions, you can go to war. Sanctions, I think, are a much more humane and less risky step than going to war.
Yes, please.
I think interesting issues are raised, but I would like to touch maybe three quickly. First, I think on the sanctions. We heard very interesting comment by Mr. Posner, if I'm pronouncing his name rightly, that today media is related to politics and money. And I think in this politics, money, and truth, the issue is how different narratives are made and are sold and are accepted. There is a narrative that sanctions worked, and the reason that Iran came and started negotiation is sanctions, and so this is actually the narrative of a lot of American officials. I think one point which is missing is in this whole debate that the reason that Iran started negotiation is the very interesting institutional, constitutional framework through which Iranians get to election, choose their executive branch, and reformulate their policies and reinvent actually how Iranian policies should be. I think, lack of attention to why Iran has evolved through a very interesting domestic processes really is, and too much focus on sanction is really misleading, and it doesn't result to a good analysis. And I think we have to understand, yes, sanctions are not good and nobody likes sanctions, but the aim of sanctions, by the Americans especially, was that we put sanctions in order to prevent Iran from going to its nuclear program more and more. But during the past administration in Iran, the number of centrifuges that we had in the beginning and after sanction, you see, the new Iranian nuclear program was expanded and it was not stopped. And the sanctions were not really resulting to the end that it wanted really to achieve. So I have to really emphasize on the narrative of sanction and election, and I think missing the election is very important, and I think this is a very important dimension. The second point is logic of sanction. Is it an alternative to war? I think the sanctions which we're putting was a let's say, a step to more confrontation in the future. So I don't accept this argument that when you put sanctions, you are really accepting the, let's say, the better solution. It seems so, but when sanctions are accumulated, it would be more confrontational mood. Finally, the third point, which is the most important one, is you think that Iran is a very passive actor sitting there. Don't forget what the West has said almost, and the agents of the West, that we attack Iran, we militarily do this, and Iranians sit aloof and not really prepare for the defense of their country. I don't mean through nuclear weapon at all, because it has no place in the Iranian defense doctrine. But Iran is a very important player in this respect, and Iranians resisted. And I think it is not an issue which is of very minor significance. Iranians resisted, built their country, and look at the region, what's happening right now. I am happy to report that we, through our struggle, could really survive, build the country, and bring the others to accept. I think Obama didn't easily accept the Iranian nuclear facility enrichment. If you go back to his speech at Sorbonne Center at Brookings, he even said he wished that Iranians didn't have anything. But we cannot accept the reality as it is. So the reality of Iran is very important, and I think it should also be into account. My final word on this, that Iranian nuclear crisis was an artificial crisis and is an artificial crisis. What have we done? What have Iran really has gone through, let's say, breaking any specific international standards? This crisis from the beginning was an artificial crisis, and it consumed a lot of energy from the region. And I think right now there is a turning point, that we really turn our attention, not be inattentive to the real issues of the region, focus on them, and really depart from this artificial hood that we have made.
I would like to give the floor to Mr. Gingrich because he must leave soon, and to reply to what...
Let me just say first, I apologize that I have to leave, but since my wife is waiting for me in Rome, I really have to leave. This is very, very important. No, the only comment I'll make is Iran is an enormously important country with a tremendous history. The world would be much better if there was a way to have a rapprochement in which the Iranian government was both more transparent and quit sustaining terrorism. And in the process, the economy opened up, we could reestablish diplomatic relations, and we'd be in a totally different world. But I think it's a little bit much to suggest that that's primarily an American problem. I think the Iranian government, which, by the way, in the election process you talked about, eliminated a whole range of candidates who were not allowed to run. I mean, so let's be clear, this is a very controlled system. I think it'd be great to get to the system you suggest is possible. I think you'd find the Americans very willing to get to that system, but I think it requires actual deeds and not just words. And I'm one of the people who's going to be watching over the next 6 to 9 months. If we get real transparency and we get real accountability, I suspect you'll see relations improve. If we don't, I suspect you'll see a dramatically harsher sanctions regime. And I would just suggest, as annoying as sanctions are, they are a lot better signal than a military attack. And I think when you get to that point, those are the only two options we have diplomatically. But I appreciate very much the audience. Again, I want to thank you. I think this is a great program. I am very impressed with everything I've seen, and I look forward very much to having future chances to have this kind of a dialogue.
Thank you. Mr. Safarov, please, you have the floor.
Я очень жалею, что господин Гингрич покидает нас. Если он услышал бы эти слова, наверняка по дороге немножко подумал бы и, может быть, повлиял бы на своих коллег в Конгрессе и в Соединенных Штатах. Дело в том, что иранская ядерная программа практически и абсолютно создана на ровном месте. Политика двойных стандартов стала главной, может быть, ведущей идеей страны, которая ведет себя из позиции силы. Как странно, то, что происходит в Иране, вот сделать монстра действительно из Ирана отвечает интересам очень многих государств. Ядерная программа Ирана, по большому счету, мало кого волнует. Соединенные Штаты, Израиль, многие арабские государства, даже они, по большому счету, не знают о сути ядерной программы Ирана. Главная структура, которая может дать экспертную оценку МАГАТЭ, не имеет никаких претензий и ни одного доказательства того, что ядерная программа Ирана развивается в таком нежелательном направлении и представляет угрозу мировому сообществу. Но давайте будем исходить из обратного. Израиль практически каждый день или через день, опираясь на какие-то собственные исследования, извещает мировому сообществу о том, что Иран находится на пороге создания ядерного оружия. И это позволяет Израилю через свои собственные рычаги давления заполучить то, что Израилю нужно, прежде всего от Соединенных Штатов. Но если вы подумали, что это наивная, так сказать, интересная вещь, и очень хорошо американцы на это идут просто так, то это не так совершенно. Дело в том, что, подыгрывая вот этому состоянию, американцам тоже интересно, поскольку они, признавая или делая вид, что действительно согласны с Израилем, оказывая помощь, напоминает многим арабским государствам, что есть сила, которая действительно угрожает их безопасности. А они, в свою очередь, особенно монархи Персидского залива, защищаясь якобы, вынуждены больше тяготеть к Соединенным Штатам, расширять свой военный бюджет и больше опираться на то, чтобы Соединенные Штаты оказали им нужную степень безопасности в случае чего. Иран был выведен, изолирован из нормального торгово-экономического процесса. Народ Ирана пострадает, добыча нефти практически в 2 раза снизилась. Но самое интересное, этот объем, мир же не перестал воспользоваться этим объемом. Этот объем нужен для развития мирового сообщества. И этот объем сейчас производит Саудовская Аравия, чтобы компенсировать эти потери. И вот излишки этого дохода распространяются Саудовской Аравией, Катаром и многими другими государствами совершенно на те проекты, которые никакого отношения к достижению стабильности в регионах не имеют. И самое интересное – это отвечать интересам и Израиля, и Соединенных Штатов. То, что сейчас происходит в Сирии, то, что сейчас происходит в Палестине, то, что сейчас происходит в Ираке, это результат этой санкционной политики. Это результат обеспечения финансовыми ресурсами через, собственно говоря, руки третьих государств, но обеспечение своих интересов, прежде всего американских, в этом регионе. Поэтому, что бы ни говорил Иран, как бы ни изворачивался бы из себя, не показал бы все свои объекты, не все равно в любом случае Запад не будет доверять Ирану, потому что доверие к Ирану не входит в их интересах. Главная задача, которая кроется за санкционной дубинкой Соединенных Штатов в Европе, это смена политического режима в Иране. А смена политического режима позволяет Соединенным Штатам прийти к решению очень важной проблемы в связи с развитием Китая, в связи с давлением на Россию. Именно Иран сейчас является буферной зоной для решения этих вопросов. Не Иран интересен Соединенным Штатам и Европе. Именно развитие Китая настораживает. И имея вассальную, лояльную политическую систему, сейчас заканчиваю, в Иране Запад и Соединенные Штаты получают возможность контролировать процессы насыщения экономики Китая или дозированное обеспечение китайской экономики ресурсами, что позволяет им в конечном итоге контролировать процессы, происходящие в регионе.
Thank you. Mr. Parsi, please, a comment from you about the sanctions and the ineffectivity of a sanction.
Well, I think actually sanctions have been effective in the sense of imposing a tremendous damage to the Iranian economy. But as has been mentioned earlier on, when you take a look at the progression of the Iranian nuclear program, next to the sanctions, you see that the sanctions have actually had almost zero effect on the progression of the nuclear program. It has an effect on the Iranian economy, but on the nuclear program. I'm sorry that Speaker Gingrich is not here to hear my comments on this because I think it's quite important. He mentioned that sanctions is a more humane path compared to war. But that's presuming that the only options that existed for the United States was to either go for war or to go for sanctions, which is not a correct statement. The only reason it may have come across as that is because hawkish elements in Washington, D.C. eliminated diplomacy as a real option. And there's been numerous instances in which the United States could have pursued a more diplomatic path, but it didn't do so and opted for sanctions instead. Let me just give you one example. In May of 2010, the Brazilian president and the Turkish prime minister go to Tehran and they managed to negotiate with the Iranian government and get the Iranian government to agree to an American proposal on how to ship out Iranian low-enriched uranium to Russia and then to France to produce fuel pads for the Tehran research reactor. This was based on an American proposal. In fact, 3 weeks before they arrived in Tehran, they had a letter in hand from the President of the United States saying that, giving them clear instructions on what needed to be achieved in order for this to be a considerable contribution to American security. Everything in that letter, the Turks and the Brazilians delivered. What the Turks and the Brazilians did not know, however, was on the Friday before the Sunday when they arrived in Tehran, Russia and China had finally come to an agreement with the United States on a sanctions resolution. And by the time the negotiations in Tehran were completed and the Iranians had agreed to a deal, President Obama had to choose not between war and sanctions, but between sanctions and a diplomatic breakthrough, which actually had been achieved. And the president chose sanctions. And he did so because he was under so much pressure from Congress to pursue sanctions, because Congress was going to impose their own sanctions regardless of what the president did. And as a result, the president, who had depleted much of his political capital on the healthcare reform, felt that he had no other choice but to go for the sanctions, even though a diplomatic breakthrough actually already had been achieved. So in that sense, sanctions was not needed in order to get the Iranians to do X, Y, and Z. Sanctions were needed to pacify Congress in order to later on create diplomatic space for the negotiations. I think we should be very careful not to fall into the mindset of thinking that the only paths in front of us are two confrontational paths, war or sanctions. Diplomacy under most circumstances are an option, granted that you have the political will to truly pursue it. In 2010, the president did not have it. In 2013, he did have it, which incidentally was partly because of the fact that the American public had reacted so ferociously against the idea of going into Syria militarily. The response of the American people had been so strong against a military option there that it actually made it easier for the president to pursue diplomacy with Iran.
Mr. Sikri, don't you think that at this point we are talking about sanctions, we are talking about diplomacy, soft diplomacy, say, soft approach diplomacy, but don't you think that basically there is a misunderstanding, because one side is saying that there is no program, no military program, and the other side is saying yes, there is a military program. So one side should accept sanction and the negotiation for something that doesn't recognize. So don't you think that is a very weird dialogue? And what do you think about it? Do you think that this nuclear military program is really non-existent, and so we are talking about sanction as a fiction?
Well, I think that any action that is taken by any country should have an objective. I mean, sanctions cannot be an end in themselves. They have to lead to something. And other speakers have pointed out how the sanctions have done nothing to retard Iran's nuclear progress. So in that sense, they have failed, although they have hurt the economy of Iran and contributed, no doubt, to an anti-American sentiment in the public. I have given my perspective on sanctions earlier. I don't think that sanctions outside the United Nations should be undertaken. And I also wish that Mr. Gingrich had been here, because I wanted to make two comments on something that he said. He first talked about the need for more transparency and authoritarianism and so forth. I think when we are dealing with sovereign states, we should keep such judgments out, because the United States itself and other countries also deal perfectly well with the most brutal dictatorships. I don't know if anyone would think that China or the Arab states are paragons of democracy and transparency, but you deal with them because that's the reality. So we should keep that out of the thing. The second, and I was a little alarmed when he talked about the only other option to sanctions is war in the Gulf. I think that is very irresponsible for anyone. I say this as an Indian because we have 6 million Indians working and living in the Gulf. Add to that maybe another 4 or 5 million Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, Nepalis, Filipinos. That's about 11, 12 million migrant workers. Any war, they will run, and the Gulf will be destabilized. Let's be clear on that. And we are not going to stand by idly while there's this little game, TV shooting going on there. So I think that also I believe that Iran will ensure that there is no oil which flows out of the Gulf, Persian Gulf, if its own oil cannot go out. And I think they have that capability. So what are we looking at? Are we looking at wanting to upend the whole world economic system, the energy security? For what? For what a few hundred congressmen and senators thinking in Washington want to do? I think that's not the way it is. We're talking about real people, real interests which are at stake here. Now, if there is no minimal trust, then you can't really move forward. But here you have a history where the IAEA says they haven't really found anything. The Iranians are saying, please examine everything on a daily basis. Now, I don't think that the Iranians, no matter how smart they are magicians, that they can produce a bomb if there's an IAEA inspection going on every day. So I think that there's little point in reiterating the same rhetoric and echoing what our Israeli friends say and do, even as they keep so quiet about what are their own capabilities in the nuclear field and the intentions. So I think that we need to have a sensible, mature dialogue, which is what I believe started a few months ago, and I would really earnestly hope that this is not derailed for any extraneous reasons.
Mr. Sajapur, please.
Thank you. Actually, I want to follow up by what His Excellency said in his final statement to reformulate our own debate. I think, look, we have a turning point, and that turning point was this Geneva Action Plan. By reaching to this agreement, which was a collective effort, and I have really to appreciate the Russian role here. I think Russia played a very interesting role in this Geneva Action Plan, as well as China and other countries. Then we had a new chapter. I think it's very important. For 10 years, we had a fight. These all pronouncements about the nature of Iranian program, whatever it is, I mean, these are issues that were used before. Now the question should be, how can we go beyond this interim agreement, which is for 6 months, and how it can be going to the final agreement? And I think if you examine the last 3 months, the negotiation over the final agreement between Iran and 5+1 is going well. We had 3 rounds of negotiation in Vienna. There is going to be more in 2-3 weeks. And what we have been reported publicly is that negotiations have been going well, and the key issues for the final agreement has been reached. And here again, I think everybody played a role and tried to really be constructive. It may be reached by July, and I think that would be a very interesting plus for everybody in the region and international community. However, there is also a lot of challenges in this respect. There are 3 sets of challenges. One on national levels. I think in the US, in the region, national politics is very important. So a lot of people really do not like this interim agreement to be finalized and to be successful. Regional players, there are some of them, I think some of them, which I really don't want to name, even tried hardly to prevent the interim agreement to be finalized. Don't forget what they said, that this is a mistake, this is what and what. Why? Because not through confrontation, but through a multilateral cooperation, this agreement was reached. And I think we have also some global issues which may be a challenge. But I think what's important is to have a futuristic approach, and we know each other well. You know, Iran is not a new nation, and Iran has been dealing with international politics for centuries and centuries. We had made a revolution, and the revolution had a motto of three parts: independence, freedom, and Islamic Republic. So independence for Iran is very important, and we understand by independence we are not going to be following the others what they say. So putting all this together, we have to have a futurist approach. And in this futuristic approach, the foremost important issue is to reach to the final agreement collectively, to implement it, and do not let third parties, be it this Congress or that assembly or this lobby or that lobby or this entity or that entity, to prevent this collective cooperation effort to be derailed. So I think this is the most. My final point here is, I think I go back again to what I said, because the discussions are very interesting. I think how we start understanding a country by our narratives is very important. The narrative on Iranian nuclear issue relates to our narrative of how Iran is. And I think to understand Iran correctly is very important. Mr. Gingrich is not here. He said something about there were some candidates, in the election. We have a constitution. Constitution sets the way that people should vote, and there are bylaws and regulation. And I think any country has its own regulation, and you cannot impose your own mindset on the others. But let's try to understand Iran. Iranians made a revolution for dignity, for respect for their own identity. Furthermore, I think what they have done during the last 30 years is produce institutions which are very important, including this election. And I think finally this narrative of Iran should relate to reality. We cannot have an imaginary Iran based on our own interests or our own narratives and say Iran is like this. No, Iran should be looked as it is.
Don't you think that Iran is somehow contributing to this narrative that you seem to like that much by statements against some countries that you didn't want to mention and promising the destruction
You see,
of
this is
some neighbors? So is somehow contributing to this narrative or not? What do you
First
think
of all,
about it?
let's see. Now,
Is this rhetoric too, or
No.
is okay?
first of all, Iran is like other countries, but it's a very colorful and diverse society. It's a debating society. So it's not one single statement. Iran is a country of 75 million, and we have different trends.
Those statements came
Let
from
me
officials
say.
very public.
You are focusing on a statement, singularizing that. But you have to understand, we have different views on different issues, and we have a colorful society. You cannot be selective. Furthermore, on the statements, Iran never had been for the physical destruction of any other country. What Iran has said on the Palestinian issue is the plight of Palestinians from the beginning, and Iran is for a just solution, for a very natural solution, and you cannot dismiss what Iranian people during not just last 3 decades, during the last 6 decades, 7 decades, have been for the right of Palestinians based on reality, on international law, and their plight cannot be ignored, their plight cannot be marginalized by singularization of different statements. And we have a diverse society. But look, when you are talking about the behavior of states, you are dealing with the states. Iran as a state is a party to all disarmament conventions. And you cannot even let an entity which is not part of these conventions to talk about the others. Iran has contributed to the peace and security of the region. And Iranian narratives, look, on all issues related to the region. We were saying from the beginning, 3 years ago, not now, that Syrian crisis doesn't have a military solution. But nobody listens. So you have to really have a comprehensive picture of what the country is, not just choosing one-sided, selective narratives in order to make confrontation. Now there is a process that we are moving from a type of file which could be confrontational to a file which can be more cooperative. And we have to, of course, more on the cooperative side, of course, based on the rights and needs of Iranian people, which are defined by international law.
Let's bring again the issue to the nuclear subject, Mr. Parsi.
Actually, it's on both, but
They are related, of course.
absolutely, they're related. And I think we should be very careful because the tensions between Iran and Israel is not about a statement here or a statement there. There's a much, much deeper issue at hand. If we go back only 3 decades, during the 1980s, at a time when the Iranian leaders were making much more frequent statements, quite venomous statements against Israel. During that period, the Israelis were working very hard to provide Iran with military assistance during the Iraq-Iran war. Back in the 1980s, it was actually Israel that in Washington was lobbying the United States to talk to Iran, to sell arms to Iran, and not pay attention to Iranian statements. It was doing so because at the time it felt that he had a geopolitical common cause with the Iranians, mindful of a perception of common threats. After the fall of the Soviet Union, a new order was brought about in the world in which the perceptions of threats in the region have diverged between Israel and Iran. But I think it's important to keep in mind that right now, with this process, if it is successful, if it is not sabotaged, and in fact, the main problem with the sanctions is not what happened in the past, but what will happen in the future. Because if the United States Congress does not lift sanctions as part of a deal, there will not be a deal. And there's significant question marks as to whether Congress is capable of doing so or whether the President of the United States is capable to get Congress to lift those sanctions. And at that moment, it will become very, very clear that sanctions was actually an obstacle to peace rather than something that facilitated it. But if it is successful, I think we should not forget that Israel actually will be one of the main winners of this deal, because it will ensure that there is no undetectable breakout capability in Iran. And mindful of the fact of the last 2 decades in which the Israelis have made so many remarks about the importance of making sure that Iran does not get a bomb, the Israelis would owe President Obama a thank you in that type of a scenario. But beyond that, I think it's important to keep in mind that this issue is not just about centrifuges and about enrichment. This is an opportunity to be able to significantly change the interaction between Iran and the West in particular, but the international community as a whole. That will open up opportunities for collaboration on very important issues, whether it is security in Afghanistan, what is happening in Syria, in Iraq, when it comes to sectarianism and how that can be quelled rather than spread. Those opportunities will be lost if we're staring ourselves blind on a statement here, a statement there, or if we're staring ourselves blind simply on enrichment and not seeing the larger picture.
Yes, Mr. Safarov, you said before that my question was rhetoric, but again, you didn't answer to that question. Was Iran preparing a nuclear weapon or not? Maybe now it's more clear.
Опять вопрос навязчивый и опять никакого отношения к реалиям не имеет. Я очень многие годы занимаюсь российско-иранскими отношениями. Я очень многие годы занимаюсь российско-иранскими отношениями и достаточно часто бываю в этой стране. Но поскольку весь мир говорит очень многие годы об иранском ядерном оружии, стремление Ирана обмануть весь мир, вопреки всему, создать это оружие якобы, у меня бывают иногда возможности приватных бесед и разговоров с определенными лицами, которые на самом деле минимум осведомлены были бы о таких программах. И я вам совершенно искренне заявляю, что я до сих пор не услышал ни от одного политика, ни от одного функционера, ни от одного технического работника, отвечающего за развитие ядерной программы Ирана, чтобы хотя бы намеком упомянул о том, что есть какая-либо другая программа. А поверьте, у меня с некоторыми из них есть доверительные отношения. Наверное, уважаемая аудитория уже устала от констатации фактов по поводу нынешнего состояния иранской ядерной программы и всех проблем в связи с этой программой. Для того, чтобы несколько оживить настроение уважаемой аудитории, я поделюсь с вами своими соображениями по поводу того, что будет в ближайшее время. Это из области, конечно, теоретических рассуждений. Украинские события так повлияли на ситуацию, что весь мир вздрогнул. И в первую очередь Запад и Соединенные Штаты. Они очень быстро стали использовать проверенный свой метод, санкционную дубинку по отношению к России. Сейчас, как говорится, Россия на своей шкуре испытывает, что такие санкции. Что такое санкции? И теперь находится в одном таком общем состоянии, положении, и более лучше понимает состояние Ирана. Вы знаете, для иранцев, наверное, подходит поговорка, которую мы называем «не было счастья, да несчастье помогло». Применив в политике санкции по отношению к России, изолировав Россию от многих коммуникационных проектов, ущемляя интересы России, выводя Россию из активного интеграционного процесса, из финансового пространства, Запад и Соединенные Штаты оказали очень серьезную медвежью услугу самому себе. Очень многие в России, особенно пятая колонна, так называемая, топ-менеджеры, политики ельцинского, иранного, путинского времени, они тысячами нитями были связаны с Западом и Соединенными Штатами. Даже финансовая система России была интегрирована в западную систему. И они эту дубинку использовали, отключив мастер-карте, визу от российских банков. Это вынудило Россию создать собственную систему. И такая система будет, собственно говоря, скоро будет введена. Сейчас, секунду. Вот одну секунду. Я сейчас подхожу к главной мысли. Вы всегда прерываете меня, но на самом деле это очень важно. Знаете, когда Россию ограничивают, Россия для того, чтобы защитить свои интересы, обращается к новым возможностям, ресурсам, к созданию каких-то альянсовых и союзнических отношений новых, чтобы компенсировать или минимизировать ущерб от этой санкционной политики. И здесь самым надежным может быть из числа возможных партнеров, с которыми следовало бы России иметь более, скажем так, активные и доверительные отношения, выступает Иран со своим потенциалом, независимостью, ресурсами и возможностями. И вот здесь, господин ведущий, вырисовывается очень интересный момент. До окончания срока договоренностей, переговорного срока 20 июля остается 3 месяца. За это время должны быть подписаны соглашения окончательные с Ираном. И вот здесь, вот в эти дни, Россия может предложить очень интересные проекты интеграционного и коммуникационного характера с Ираном. И наверняка вы знаете об серьезном обсуждении большого нефтяного контракта. А это означает, что у России появится стимул более активный защищать те перекосы, от тех перекосов, которые видны и бывают в каждый день по отношению к Ирану на международной арене, даже в рамках переговорного процесса с «шестеркой». А для того, чтобы вот этого сближения российско-иранского не было, мне кажется, что американцы закроют на очень многие свои проблемы и могут сделать Ирану такие предложения, которые Иран не может отказаться от них. И я думаю, что вот меня почему-то вселяет оптимизм, что к 20 июля все-таки это всеобъемлющее соглашение с Ираном будет подписано, но не из-за того, что американцы и Запад вдруг поверили Ирану, а из-за того, что не допустить дальнейшего сближения Ирана с Россией.
Thank you. Mr. Parsi, I would like a comment from you on this issue, on this last part.
I'm not so sure that Russian-Iranian relations are that central in the American considerations. If it was, it's difficult to explain why the policy that the United States has pursued for such a long time has actually been quite beneficial for Russian-Iranian relations. What is happening that has shifted the American perspective on this issue is primarily because of the fact that the president is now in his second term. He has only about 2 years left, a little bit more than 2 years left. He does not have any significant successes on the foreign policy front that would enable him to have a strong foreign policy legacy. And Iran, which a year ago appeared impossible for the United States for a number of reasons. A, the domestic political situation in the United States, but also the challenges that the United States had with the Ahmadinejad government. Now, a year later, Iran looks like the most plausible, the most feasible issue to address in the Middle East. Clearly much easier than addressing Syria, much easier than addressing Israel-Palestine. Suddenly there's a promise that an agreement can be found in the negotiations with Iran, and I think that has catapulted the American or the president's own political will to pursue this path. And I want to emphasize that personally I was surprised. I had not expected that the president would be able to come in and be so forceful and manage to insulate the negotiations to the extent that it's become very, very difficult for the opponents of the deal internally in the United States to scuttle it. Doesn't mean that it can't happen, but it's been much better protected than many had expected to be.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we must draw this interesting session to a close. So I would like our distinguished participant, our distinguished speakers, to give a last message to the audience. And thank you very much. I would start from Mr. Sikri, in the order from Mr. Safarov.
I think the Iranian case has brought out the flawed nature of the NPT. What Iran is seeking is nothing but its rights under the NPT. We believe in India that it's a flawed document, which is why we haven't signed that document. But I think that you cannot say that a certain number of countries, 5, have the perpetual right to nuclear weapons because their security demands it, whereas others should not have that right. I think that creates a problem. It also means that you're not committed to disarmament. And if you attach so much importance to nuclear weapons, then others begin to wonder, well, what is it in it that we should also not be having? I think this is a very fundamental problem. It's not just the Iranian dossier. I think it's a broader question of disarmament and going ahead on the nuclear side. So I would suggest that as we look at the Iranian dossier, the Iranian case, we look at these broader issues also.
Thank you. Mr. Safarov?
Украинские события, возвращение Крыма в Россию, так сказать, очень сильно повлияли на поведение мировых лидеров. Особенно, мне кажется, Барак Обама потерял интерес уже к России, и между ними, между Путиным и Бараком Обамой, думаю, что не будет доверительного отношения, и Обама не настроен и не надеется на какие-то конструктивные отношения с Россией за оставшее время, и тем более с Путиным. Поэтому думаю, что руководство Соединенных Штатов будет сосредотачиваться на решении других международных проблем, и ядерная программа Ирана или Исламской Республики Иран будет приоритетным вопросом, где Барак Обама может иметь хоть какое-то преимущество, какой-то актив, поскольку от поведения Ирана зависит дальнейшая ситуация в Сирии, от возможностей потенциала Ирана зависит будущее, реально зависит будущее Афганистана, от отношений Ирана практически зависит реальная ситуация в Ираке, от поведения Ирана зависит ситуация в зоне Персидского залива, где сосредоточены интересы Соединенных Штатов. Поэтому я полагаю, что вот этот комплекс вопросов вынуждает руководство Соединенных Штатов все-таки отбросить стереотипы, которые у них сложились, и смотреть на Иран, на реальную региональную силу, на которую можно будет опереться в решении тех вопросов, которые жизненно затрагивают интересы Соединенных Штатов. Это одна причина. Вторая причина заключается в том, что мир, век коммуникационных процессов, уже не утаишь разноуровневые отношения с разными странами. Америка говорит о правах человека, о нераспространении, о борьбе с международным терроризмом, но одновременно имеет очень тесные отношения, стратегические отношения со странами, которые являются источником поддержки международного терроризма, где нет практически никаких признаков соблюдения прав человека, где нет элементарных элементов демократических институтов. И это в глазах мирового сообщества становится более чем очевидным, что политика двойных стандартов является главной политикой Запада и Соединенных Штатов. И вот это заставляет отойти немножечко Соединенных Штатов от традиционных партнеров в зоне Персидского залива и увидеть, что по многим показателям Иран может быть очень перспективным и предпочтительным партнером. И это все вселяет в нас надежду о том, что в самое ближайшее время будет решена одна из самых наиопаснейших вопросов международной ситуации, международной политики, иранская ядерная программа. И это заставит Соединенные Штаты умерить аппетиты Израиля и вести себя более корректно в регионе, чтобы не спровоцировать дальнейшее ухудшение ситуации по дестабилизации этого региона. Я, во всяком случае, с оптимизмом смотрю на будущее в решении иранской ядерной программы.
Thank you very much, Mr. Safarov. Now, Mr. Parsi.
Thank you. I'll go back to one of the things I said earlier on, which is that we have to recognize that this is so much bigger than just about the nuclear program. You cannot create stability in a region by excluding some of its most powerful countries from the order and the organizing principle of that region. Yet that is exactly what has happened with Iran and with the Middle East for the last 3 decades. The United States has a policy of isolating Iran. It was at times just called an isolation policy, then it was called a dual containment policy. And that isolation actually became one of the root causes of the instability, because if a major state is excluded and does not have any legitimate avenues for influence, it will work against that order. It will become an anti-status quo state because it is excluded. And if this nuclear program is, this nuclear negotiation is successful, and Iran can be rehabilitated in the region, while at the same time, of course, having to accept many of the rules and principles for that region and see some of the activities that it has engaged with in the past, then you will have the promise of seeing a much more stable Middle East in which the main countries of that region can uphold its own security, rather than having the situation that we've seen for the last couple of decades in the Middle East, in which it is constantly one of the sources of global instability.
Mr. Sajapur.
Yes, very quickly, I have 3 points. First, don't reduce Iranian, let me rephrase, don't be reductionist on Iran. What do I mean? Don't reduce a big country and a regional power to nuclear program per se, and don't reduce the nuclear program to a nuclear weapon program. So first, we have to say goodbye to these reductionist approaches. I think they are not healthy and they are not good. Second, I think we have to be hoping and working on this new phase of cooperative mode to go on. And I think it will go on if we accept a more comprehensive approach rather than a reductionist approach. My third point is Iran is more than a nuclear file, more than one file or 2 files or 3 files. You cannot have peace and security in this great region without taking into account the role of Iran, because it is a real regional power which feels responsibility for its security and the security of its surrounding, and it cares about its independence, and it's not going to be dependent upon any type of, let's say, proxies. It is a genuine, and I have to report to you that it's the only regional player in this region that is producing its security domestically. And I think it's a great, important issue to take into account that we are talking about a country with a great civilization, a great political process, a lot of significant human achievements, and a very significant player in this region. The more we understand Iran in a better picture, not with pre-assumptions, pre-cooked judgments, I think we are going to have a better region and a better world. And I'm really hopeful that it will happen. And I thank you, the organizer of this very good debate and forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to the participants and to the speakers. Their contribution was very interesting. Thank you.